Hi everyone, thanks for watching my video. I've put a huge challenge upon myself to build this out of the ordinary cave diorama. You don't normally find cave dioramas on YouTube. As far as I can see, this is the first one. So let's see what happens, and if you like it, please give it a thumbs up. I'm using 15mm chipboard to get a sturdier base, and I'm sealing the edges with wood filler to make the paint job easier later on. I'm using a small and a large hot glue gun and a soldering iron that doubles up as a foam cutter. These tools are very handy for making those stalactite and stalagmite formations. These are the blow torches that I used for creating nicer effects with the hot glue. And I used quite a lot of these hot glue sticks. I practiced a lot, and after a while I got the results that you see in the middle there at the back. And I used the barbecue skewers to make stalactites and stalagmites from hot glue and plaster of Paris. First, I'm sanding down the edges of the chipboard. Here I'm starting the process of cutting down the styrofoam with a hot wire tool. This is factory insulation. It's a nice and dense polystyrene. I like to work with it. I'm using quite a lot of it. The diorama will be 4 layers high of this material. I'm using wood glue to stick the bottom layer to the base, but between the layers I'm using this styrofoam glue because the hot wire foam cutter is able to cut through it more easily. I'm deliberately creating an overhang on the sides because I will cut it down later with the bandsaw. I made this stalagmite from hot glue. There's a barbecue skewer in the middle. And the method I'm using is building up layers of hot glue. And it should look like jellyfish heads with tentacles hanging down. You can see there, it looks like a jellyfish. And I made a couple of layers of tentacles. Each time I build up a new layer on the head and drag down the little tentacles with a toothpick. This is quite a small stalagmite. You'll see on the bigger one that I used the glue gun to create those tentacles. And you can see also that I used the small blowtorch to smoothen down the jellyfish heads. Here I'm starting the process of building up another layer of hot glue to create another jellyfish head. And it's a long process. I can't show you the whole process because this video will get too long. It's just a matter of practicing the way I did. And then I start with building up another layer. I start pulling down those tentacles with a toothpick while the head is still nice and hot. Otherwise it doesn't look good and it doesn't work as well when the glue is starting to cool down. As soon as you put hot glue onto a cold head, you can start pulling those tentacles down. The disadvantage of hot glue is that nothing really sticks to it, especially plaster of Paris. So you have to cover it up with acrylic paints, hobby paints. For instance, I'm using Tamiya acrylic paints. And after that, almost anything will stick to it. But what I didn't realize here was I put in all this effort to create this masterpiece in my mind. But in the end, I covered almost all of it with plaster of Paris. And if I knew that while I was doing this, I wouldn't have spent so much time creating the stalagmite. I'm sure there are fellow hobbyists out there that would be satisfied with the look of this stalagmite at this stage. Then you can just leave it like this. Don't cover it up with plaster of Paris and just paint it with a paint that will stick to the hot glue, and I'm sure it will look very nice on your diorama. Here I'm starting with a different approach. I'm cutting polystyrene into different shapes that I think will look like stalagmites, and it's obviously bigger than the previous one, and it's not made of hot glue entirely. But keep in mind while you're doing this that inside a cave everything is formed by dripping water, so make sure those heads of the stalagmite formations are sloping downwards. So here are the two very rough results I ended up with, but I'm going to cover these with plaster of Paris and it will look much better afterwards. You can see that the consistency of the plaster is very runny and it makes the job easier, and you can work longer with the plaster. Just be careful when you start working with hot glue and your butane torches. There's styrofoam underneath that thin layer of plaster, and if you put too much heat on it, it will suddenly collapse and make a big hole. Use your blowtorch to smoothen down those bumpy areas that you made with your glue gun. I'm covering this whole formation with hot glue. I'm using the small glue gun to create those little stalactites. I'm working from the inside out to create different layers. It will definitely have a more realistic look to it. I also covered most of this formation with plaster of Paris, but you'll see more of it in the end result. I tried my best to make those tentacles hang in an exactly vertical position, but it's much more difficult than it looks. After it dried for about 24 hours, I'm starting to cut out the cave wall, or cavity if you like, in the shape that I think will make a beautiful cave. This is the first layer of plaster I'm pouring. In some places there will be about 3 layers, and this is the back part that will be covered and not seen as much. So I'm not too much worried about the detail at the back. Towards the sides I'm going to build up more prominent 3-dimensional lines. Here you can see the result after the first layer. With the second layer I'm using a spoon to guide the plaster into the difficult areas. I'm trying to create depth with heavy textured vertical lines that will create a 3-dimensional look once painted. As the plaster starts to set, you get a more dramatic effect. Next I'm cutting out the roof, and I'm cutting deeper towards the front so that the roof slopes downwards towards the back. I'm not too worried about a neat job at this stage because the roof will be covered with several layers of plaster at a later stage. Here I'm using a different material to make stalagmite formations with a different appearance. This is ordinary egg carton that I grind up with a blender. I stuff that container as full as possible, and I mix that with the same amount of plaster of Paris. I mix those two ingredients up in a mixing bowl by hand, and please take note on the amount of water that I add to that whole in the recipe. If it's too dry, that sculpting material will set in about a minute. You'll have to practice and see how much water to add just to get the right consistency. Rather add a little too much water than too little, because you can always wait a little longer before you start working with the product. This is obviously the base of the stalagmite formation. These bases are normally very smooth. Use your fingers to smoothen down the product. And if your fingers are getting too dry, wet them with water and continue smoothing it down. This formation will also be mostly covered by plaster of Paris. The different types of stalactite and stalagmite formations and how they were formed are endless. In this diorama, I'm trying to replicate as many as I can with all the different materials that I'm using. After the second layer of plaster, I'm covering all the side walls of the diorama with light brown as a base color directly out of the tube. Here you can see where I added that stalagmite that I built earlier. These stalactites were made out of barbecue skewers and covered with hot glue and then painted with hobby paints. I decided to change the shape of the cave wall. Here I'm trying my hand on something that I'm not totally unfamiliar with. But please leave me a comment of what you think of my clay sculpting abilities. Working on a cutting mat will surely help you draw straighter lines. hung this piece onto the back wall about 24 hours after I made it. It was still soft and not fully cured, so I could bend it into the shape of the back wall. Three stalagmites that we made out of polystyrene, plaster of Paris and hot glue were given a layer of soupy plaster. I'm giving them a light brown wash because they already got the darker base color underneath. I had to cut out the roof for the change in the structure. My plan is to make those stalactites connect to the bottom. I ground up this sculpting material in my coffee grinder that comes with my blender to make it into a finer paste. I covered some areas with a third layer of plaster. As I progressed, I found that it's better to paint certain areas of the new plaster and let it dry, then come back later with another layer of wash and paint over those previous washes to give you that contrast in colors. Here you can still see the dark base coat. These stalactites are attached to the roof, and the roof still needs to be removed plenty of times because I still need to work on the inside of the cave. And the plan I devised here was to cut out that section of roof and attach it with barbecue skewers to the base, to the side walls, so that I can still remove the roof when I need to. Here I'm using the sculpting material so that I can attach those stalactites to the base. Here's where the difficult part starts, where you have to get your fingers into that cramped space. Don't worry too much about the detail in the sculpting material, because this whole area will be covered with plaster soon. I'm using my second-hand torture tools that I got from a dentist to shape those uneven areas. Any leftover sculpting material is spread out over the floor. This 60 milliliter syringe works perfect to get that plaster in those cramped areas at the back. It has a very large nozzle that makes it much easier for the plaster to flow through, and you can even extend that nozzle with a thin piece of rubbery tube to reach even further at the back. Never worry about plaster splashing onto the surrounding areas. It's easy to cover it up with washes and you'll never notice it. This is how the section of roof looks after it was cut out. It was pinned down with barbecue skewers to the side walls, and if you're careful, this formation will stay intact. This is just another method of making stalactites out of plaster. Just continue with this process. The plaster will eventually start to set, and you'll get the results you're looking for. Here the plaster is starting to set, and you just have to gently shake it down so that it doesn't form one solid block of plaster. Before you pour your second layer of plaster onto your roof, make sure to wet the surface properly, otherwise the plaster sets almost immediately. The stalactites that are already attached to the roof were fixed in position with the sculpting material. On the floor I repeated the same process as on the roof. Just make sure to wet those areas underneath properly. I'm giving the roof its final layer. Every time I put a new layer of plaster onto the roof, I make sure to weigh down onto the base because it tends to curl up or bend and you'll have gaps later to fill. I'm using this rubberized waterproofer because I worked with plaster on the floor and I don't want the plaster to dissolve in the water test where I determine the edges of the pond. I used white acrylic paint to break the black of the waterproofer. I'm sealing all the areas that were covered with the light brown washes. That includes the side walls and the roof with Mod Podge matte finish to protect those washes from any damage. I'm covering the turquoise color with a light brown wash. Because the water in this cave will be crystal clear, I painted this effect with my airbrush, and you'll see in the end result what a great effect it will have. Once an object is submerged underwater, it changes color, and this was what I was trying to simulate here. There is always a transition color between the water areas and the land areas right above it. After a lot of procrastination and careful thinking and planning, I decided this was time for the roof to be glued onto the base. This was also the time for those big formations that I built earlier to be fixed into position, and I used the sculpting material to fix it onto the floor. I started filling the gaps between the roof and the base, and it will be covered with plaster and afterwards washes, and it will be unnoticeable. I'm painting Mod Podge gloss onto the areas that I think should look wet. Only certain areas in the cave are wet and dripping, and I'm trying not to overdo this effect. These are the LEDs I normally work with. They're easy to work with, they're cheap, and it's got a sticky back, and it adheres very well to an area that you've painted with Mod Podge gloss. I'm using a 2 amp adapter because it generates much less heat with the LEDs, and it doesn't burn the paint. I put a little blob of solder on the copper strips on the one end of the LED strip. I bend the tip backwards and twist the two wires together and space them out evenly so that it makes the soldering process easier. I've put a little solder and soldering flux onto the two tips of the wires. This is the exciting part where I start preparing for the resin pour. In the front you can see that I've used packaging tape and sealed it with wood glue. I put paint containers on different places on the floor just to make sure the diorama is level. And in the front is a piece of hardboard that I used for sturdy backing for the packaging tape. After I've read the instructions on the resin containers, I used water with the same ratios as on the instructions and draw these lines on the side of the cup. I kept on stirring the resin until it became perfectly clear. I didn't show you the whole mixing process, but you can see in the cup the resin is crystal clear. Leave the resin for a couple of minutes for the bubbles to surface and use your small blowtorch to pop the bubbles. After about 5 minutes, I repeated the process of popping the bubbles. I'm covering the front of the diorama with wrapping plastic as soon as possible to protect it from insects and dust that will fall onto the resin. Look at the amount of dust that collected on the plastic after only a couple of minutes. Now for the unveiling process. I'm carefully removing the hardboard from the packaging tape. The overspray on the lower edges will be painted with a light brown wash again to soften the effect of the overspray, but it will mostly stay like that, and it will be covered with Mod Podge. On the left is the back of the diorama, and I covered the sides with cardboard and painted it black. The front edge of the diorama received a layer of Cornish adhesive that will be covered with skimming plaster and will be sanded down later on. Use a dripping wet brush to level the skimming plaster. Read the instructions on the container to see how long you have to wait before you have to start sanding it down. Trim the overhanging edges back with a hobby knife.